everybody. My name is Steve Tinney. I'm the Deputy Director of the museum. Many thanks to you, as always, for coming out to tonight's sold-out installment of our annual Greats Lectures. This year, of course, our theme is the rise of the city, to tie in with the opening of our new Middle East galleries, which have actually opened since last we met. So if you haven't already seen them, I know a lot of you have. If you haven't already seen them, come back, check them out. We think they're fantastic, and I've been getting feedback just tonight that you agree, which is wonderful. So enjoy them. As most of you know by now, we've selected speakers and topics which give us kind of a 360-degree view of what makes a city, how cities grow, where and why. And the next lecture in our series will be Jeffrey Rayy, formerly Senior Curator at the Philadelphia History Museum at the Atwater, Kent, who will bring the series home, quite literally, when he talks about Philadelphia, colonial city to modern metropolis. And as those of you who've been in the gallery know, we do the same in the galleries. As many of you know already, after our speaker's presentation, there'll be time for some Q&A. And as usual, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the mic that comes around so everybody can hear the questions. And now it is my truly great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Renata Holod, who was deeply involved in the preparation of the Middle East galleries herself and was the driving force in the presentation of materials from Islamic and Persian sites in the third room. I'd like to take this opportunity to offer my sincere thanks to her for all her efforts there. So thank you, Renata. Renata is the College for Women class of 1963 term professor in the humanities in Penn History of Art and curator in the Near East section here in the Penn Museum. She received her BA in Islamic Studies from the University of Toronto, an MA in the History of Art from the University of Michigan, also one of my alma maters, and PhD in Fine Arts from Harvard University. Her colleagues and friends know her as an incredibly committed scholar, teacher, and mentor. So it came as no surprise in 2010 when she received the Provost's Award for Distinguished PhD Teaching and Mentoring. Renata has done field work and architectural field work in Syria, Iran, Morocco, Central Asia, Turkey, and on the island of Jerba in Tunisia. Her most recent project is a collaborative study of the grave goods of a Kipchak kurgan in the Black Sea steppe of the 13th century. Renata has authored numerous works, including City in the Desert, an account of the archaeological expedition to Qasr al-Hayr al-Shaki, Syria, and The City in the Islamic World, highly relevant to tonight. In 2010-11, she co-curated the exhibition Archaeologists and Travelers in Ottoman Lands here in the Penn Museum, which also exhibited at the Pera Museum, Istanbul, under the name Osman Hamdi Bey and the Americans. I know we are all looking forward to hearing from her about the city in the Islamic world, theory, plan, law, and use. So I'm going to hand over now to Renata.
So today, I want to introduce you to the city after war. Because after all, the cities continue until they're there with us today, as we can see from Philadelphia. So to begin with, on the screen, you see 4 images of cities that are drawn from a manuscript that was made for probably Suleiman the Magnificent. And it is essentially a series of routes that are presented by a certain Nasuh Matrakchi. And you can see that each of these has its own image. So there is already, and so by the 16th century CE, that is close to Philadelphia's beginning, there is an idea that a city is not only what you live in, but a city is also an image of a city. And that, you know, certain cities look this way or that way and have their own idea. Okay, so let's now move forward. Here are the terms I would like to actually introduce you to. So we have a whole series of literatures that we deal with, both in Arabic and in Persian. And they deal with cities in one way or another. It's a very rich corpus of geographical literature. Begins in about the 9th century CE and then continues. And it describes the routes and realms, literally from the Atlantic to the Hindu Kush. And within each of these areas, there is a description that is based on old records, waybooks, travelers' accounts, and then local histories and descriptions. So this is basically what I'm going to be dealing with. So a Medina, a city, is defined in all of this literature as a place that has contiguously built houses with a congregational mosque. 2, that the city is owned by its rulers, according to the great philosopher Ibn Khaldun in his Introduction to History. 3, that in fact the Arabic term for civilization comes from the word Medina, and it is tamaddun. So civilization cannot happen without cities, and a city cannot happen without a congregational mosque and contiguously built housing. So the literature, oh, is this working? No? Okay. The literature is huge on local histories. Every city has its local history. Some local patriot sits down and says, I will tell you everything about this city from the time it was founded to now. I will list every single major monument. I will list every single famous person who comes from this city. Now, further, within Islamic law, there is only a person, a legal person is the only person there is. So municipality as such cannot be a legal person. This is actually really, really important. And we'll come why this is so. In any case, but separate from that, the authority in the city then has a market inspector, a muhtasib, who has a manual called the Hizbah, and it is the zoning manual, and a manual for market regulations that are enforced, obviously, theoretically, they're always enforced all the time, but we know that things are enforced variously, right? And that's true across the board. But there are two other concepts I think that are really, really important. One, that there is a concept of a public street. The public street that is owned by the people who own the city, who are the actual rulers of the city. Whereas the lanes are actually owned by every householder whose door opens onto that lane. So within the city fabric as such, you have large streets, avenues in fact, that connect from gate to gate, whereas there are islands between these avenues that are actually quiet, and they are dead-end streets. So this way you can actually have fairly dense city living and still maintain some manner of quiet and privacy. Then, so this is basically the framework within which I would like to talk. All cities in the pre-modern period were walled and typically had a citadel, the city proper, Medina, or in Persian, Shahristan, and the suburbs. Now, to be recognized as a city, as I said, it had to have a congregational mosque. And then further, the authority, right, not only guaranteed safety of the city, of the urban population, minted coins, right, and guarded both city and region. Doesn't matter which city, inheritance laws, as they were practiced, and probably still are practiced in many places in the Middle East, meant that everybody inherits, ascending parallel, and descending family, so that a house on a dead-end street does not last any longer than one generation, because it can be actually cut up into pieces. And I'll show you examples of some fieldwork that I did that show exactly this. All of this is handled through the courts. And one way of getting around the enforced division of property is to set up a foundation where one names one's favorites, relatives, as the foundation administrators and benefactors. So there are ways around what looks to be a fairly draconian splitting of property. Okay, whoops. So now, I am not going to talk about the two most important centers within the Islamic world, which is Mecca and Medina. And here I'm showing you two images. On the right is Mecca. On the left is Medina, that come from an Ottoman source that is a 17th century image. But, and we have many other images. So, you know, there are images of Mecca, images of Medina, images of, in fact, every city that you can think of to worry about. Where are we? So, oops, go back. I'm going to look at several different locations, and they're going to be mainly within the Middle East, but I'm going to also mention one that I've been associated with, which is in Tunisia, in Tunis. But otherwise, we have Cairo, we have Baghdad, we have Rayy, and then it is actually in this zone more than otherwise. Okay. Oops. And in terms of time, I'm going to talk about the 9th century, and I'm going to end up in the 17th. So that in the 17th century, you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Persian state, and the contested territories in between, and that will be actually part of what I talk about as well. As I said, exactly in this image series from, again, from the Ottomans, we actually have images of, you know, this is Tabriz in northwestern Iran. Well, did it actually look like this? Well, no. But you see, what you see on, there's a water channel on the left are various locations that indicate the monuments, and then there are the stand-ins for the houses. I did not excavate Tabriz of this time. Probably nobody did. Okay. Now, moving forward, here is a place that actually has, whose urban fabric has disappeared. If you go to Sultaniya today, again in northwestern Iran, you only find the two large monuments. All of the other stuff, as already indicated here, has just been abandoned. So cities don't necessarily last until our time. Some do not. And there are various reasons for it. The great geographer, Al-Muqaddasi, Muqaddasi means that he comes from Jerusalem. His grandfather was an architect. So he wrote a large geographical book where he actually explains what are the cities. And what is very interesting, if you actually map them, you can see, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening here? In the Middle East, there are many more places called Medina than in the West. Look, there are only 3, 4 that he mentions in addition to Cairo. Are kind of empty. But when we look at his ranking of cities, so any city, the dot gives you where this is now in eastern Iran, northeastern Iran. N means Nishapur. S means Samarkand. So this is now already in what is today Uzbekistan. And then you can see within this geography, you have a ranking of cities. So Misr is the capital of a province, of an entire province. And then Kasaba is the next level, and then finally Medina, and then and the open symbols are basically some kind of smaller towns that are hard to understand in terms of administration. Okay. But today I want to consider all of these quickly. How do inherited cities look when, in fact, they are now under a different concept of public and private? And I'm going to deal with all of these: Damascus, Aleppo, Rayy, Merv. Fiat cities, those that were founded at a certain time. What happened with them? Organic cities. There was a crossroads between a road going one way, a road going another, and all of a sudden this thing just popped up. And finally, the grand city, organic, inherited, and garden city, that is exactly finishes off when Philadelphia takes off. Okay. So Damascus. Well, here is Damascus as represented in a drawing by Dorothea Sack that shows us the underpinning, which is still the old Hellenistic city. And what happens? The street called Straight is still there, going right across. But all of these other places, are the alleys, the blocks themselves are now, turned inward. All of these different locations. And why did this happen? Let's look one more set. Here's another. This is Damascus circa 1200, where you have the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, and then all of the other places. The main mosque has replaced, is in the same location as the Hellenistic temple. That in it was then replaced by a cathedral of St. John the Baptist. That in turn was then replaced by the Congregational Mosque. That is basically Damascus. So only some of its older pattern remains. All of this other stuff has already been, if you want, pressed by this new concept of inheritance. Okay, Aleppo. Here is 1920s Aleppo. Okay. Here is the mid-16th century Aleppo, and you can see that, in fact, what's most important for Nasuh Matrakchi is that there is a huge tell in the middle of the city, right, which has been turned into a citadel and surrounded by a moat and so on, and then the city around it, and you can see that there is actually a very clear distinction between the bath house here, right? This is actually the dome of a bath. You see one over there. And then other kinds of places as well. And when we actually study this as mapped in the early 20th century, we can see that some of the older fabric of the city still has been maintained, whereas some of the through streets are there, whereas the location of the citadel has, so it's actually quite the same as inherited. Okay. So this is what happens over time. Number one is the Hellenistic city. Number three is basically the inherited 14th century city. Why did this happen? One very important thing. I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that in the Eastern Mediterranean and throughout the Islamic world, wheeled transport disappeared. So you did not need to have a street that could actually take the tracks. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Pompeii or other places where you actually see the ruts that have been, marked out by the wheels. For reasons we can't explain, wheel transport simply is no longer there. What takes its place? Beasts of burden, right? A fully laden donkey, but much more important, is a fully laden camel that can transport 4 times the load of a wheeled transport and then certainly of other beasts of burden. This means that to pass 2 fully laden camels on the street, you did not need to maintain the boundaries of the street. They can pass like this, right? They don't need to be next to each other this way. So this then is actually a very interesting analysis. So what happens here? So it's based on Aleppo to a large extent, but many cities undergo this, particularly the inherited cities, where the colonnade of the street can be built into the bazaar, but the actual property of the street and the line of the street is no longer maintained. Think of what would have happened to Philadelphia. People started to, build out into every street. We actually have a very clear idea of, well, this is municipality and this is mine at every level. Okay. So now let's look at an inherited place. And this one is particularly important because it was actually, the excavations in this location were funded by this very museum. And Eric Schmidt excavated this place in the late 30s. And what we have here is a citadel on the mound, a Shahristan, a Medina, and then the rest of it further up here. This is an aerial photograph that the University Museum paid for. So we're in good shape here. Okay. But when we map it, this is actually how it looks. So again, the citadel is on the very top. The Shahristan, the Medina, is here, and then all of the rest of it is expanded. But the key thing to remember, particularly after the 10th century through the early 13th century, was that you have these huge avenues that come down. They are the parade avenues. So it's a street called in Persian a khiyaban, where there are parades that go up and back to the various locations, connect with the gates, and are typically used for display. So military parades during the New Year, all of these are public places where this happens. And then also notice the location of the cemeteries and the large memorial buildings that are connected to the cemeteries. Rayy was destroyed by the Mongols in the 1220s. Its successor, much, much later, in the middle of the 19th century, is, of course, today's Tehran, that today has eaten up most of this site. And we're now working on publishing, believe it or not, the finds from this that are quietly resting or have been quietly resting in the basement of this museum. Okay. Another city that is inherited is Merv in present-day Turkestan. And here you see again that what you actually have is the end of an irrigated area, right? All of this, and then two enclosed large cities. They look like this, where the first one on my right is called the very old citadel, and then you have the Medina or Shahristan, and next to it is now the newer one. So clearly by the beginning of the 13th century, the old one was, this was Society Hill before they duded it up. Right? Okay. So now let's consider this other set. What is a fiat city? Let there be a city. And it became. And I thought just for fun I would introduce you to one that I excavated myself, or I was part of the team that was excavating it. And it's now called, it's to the east of Palmyra. It's called Kasr al-Hir al-Sharqi, but in fact finally in the literature we ended up figuring out that it was actually called Zaytuna. Now Zaytuna in Arabic means olive grove. And so this is how it looked in the first aerial photographs that were taken by Père Poidebard in the late 20s. And you see that it has a large enclosure, a small enclosure, and then this huge outer enclosure which you see here. And then the large enclosure, and you have it here, is fascinating in itself because here is the mosque, Here's an administrative building. How is it that I know this? Well, it has too many entrances to be anything else. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 houses, mansions, with interior courtyards and a backyard, each of them, all opening up into yet a large other piazza inside. Olive presses. So that is why probably, definitely a zaytuna. And here is me excavating the decoration that was actually in the administrative building right there. But what's fascinating about this thing was laid out. We know who paid for it. The people of Homs paid for this. But by the 10th century, it's dead. And that's another whole story. It revives again in the 12th century. And once the Mongols destroy Baghdad and many other cities along the Euphrates, it's finished. So the long-livedness of a city or the non-livedness of a city is actually a very interesting, problematic, all told. Okay, so that's the Fiat city. Now another one. Well, it's actually Baghdad. Baghdad was the they decided they were going to have a perfectly round city. And in fact, somebody actually drew up a plan, and then they transferred the plan onto the plain by a very careful geometrical surveying to make a perfectly round city. But where it is interesting because, of course, here is the Sasanian capital, Madain. This is called Madain in Arabic, means place of cities. Madain plural is just Medina, right? Here is Baghdad, right? And Ctesiphon still was there. This is a photograph of the early 20th century. This was standing. That was the ruin that was over there. So the people who were founding Baghdad were perfectly aware of the fact that, yes, we know that there is that old place there. We're not going to bother with it. Here is the great arch in Ctesiphon. And that's, I took this photograph. That is actually one of my travel companions there, so you can see what are we talking about in terms of megalomania. Another one, and you see where it is. But what's important is to see where Baghdad is located. Baghdad is strategically located at the place where the Tigris and Euphrates come closest together. And therefore, you can have irrigation canals that connect the two. And laying out the perfectly round city is right there. Yeah? The Byzantine ambassador who came to visit the Caliph saw that this perfectly round city, which looked like this, had the palace inside and said, "You are a prisoner of your own people," which is interesting. This is actually also a diagram for the empire because every single one of these locations was supposed to be a quarter for people from another place, from the Atlantic to the Hindu Kush, representatives. Now, whether they all moved in here, nobody says. I mean, not a single source says this, but nonetheless, this is actually important, that there was a kind of an idea that, yes, this represents the empire, and this is how we represent it. This is how it should look. Now, at some point, the Caliph took the Byzantine ambassador's advice and said, fine, great, Baghdad is terrific, but we should move upriver at a place called Samarra. See where Baghdad is? See where Samarra is. Why? So for 80 years, in the 9th century, the actual place of administration was upriver from Baghdad. Baghdad remained, a perfectly viable economic place. It was actually, by the end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century, was probably the largest city in the world. But the court packs up and then they move. So this is actually not necessarily all contemporaneous. It's 80 years, but 80 years they were building one after the other, after the other, after the other location. So there's a race course there. There are various other locations. You can see where the palaces are indicated. And then after that, packed up and left, went back to Baghdad. But not the round city any longer, because the round city had been overrun. It was packed. So that's not where you want to actually have administration and court. So this is what Samarra looks like. I flew over it, so this is actually probably my photograph. It's abandoned. Abandoned palaces, abandoned barracks, abandoned, abandoned, abandoned. But the twin aspect of it, Baghdad, Samarra, meant that you had exactly this idea, that this is the place where you've got the economic life, mercantile life, what have you, and over here you have the administration. And they're sort of removed. Think of, well, it used to be New York and Washington. They're even more removed. Okay. And marking the place is this great tower, and you can see the scale by actually the people who are climbing on top of it, that actually will give you a view of this entire administrative capital. But it only lasted 80 years. Always makes me wonder, what makes cities thrive and last longer? And then why did some just not take off? So the next one is Cairo. Along the Nile, not on the Mediterranean, but further up into actually the Nile, next to a city that was already there. In the 10th century, the rival dynasty to the people who were controlling Baghdad, the Fatimids, come in and say, we are going to set up our own camp, and it's going to be right here. Again, we're not going to move into the city, we're going to be outside. That's 10th century thinking. The same thing happens in Cordoba and Medina Zahra. If you go to Spain, you go to Cordoba, where's the palace city? It's there on the slopes. So here is what happens to Cairo. Cairo is successful. Fustat is forgotten. So by the 14th century, Cairo, this is the actual city, the 10th century city, has accreted to itself all of the economic activity that was once in Fustat. Fustat is just ruins and rubbish. Okay? So now let's consider Tunis. That's the crossroads. Nobody really founded it. There was a crossroads, there was a bazaar at the crossroads, and all of a sudden, for reasons that we don't know, it was set up. And it is there until now. But there was no, if you want, political or ideological reason for it. Okay? And here's the city that I studied in Iran called Yazd. It's not a very large city. And it began, I don't know how many of you can see this, from a very small settlement. Here's the next one. Here are the city walls, and you can actually see them right there. That's the next one. And then finally you have this. So that's 9th century, 11th century, 14th century. Right? So the no real drawing on the ground, none of the, no real administrative tralala, or for that matter, ideological tralala, but just it grew. And behind all of this, we have to understand that there are plans. Now, I've showed you some of the images of the cities, but together with actual plans that we see here, here's a plan for a building, we actually also have plans for areas. And this one is from the Uzbekistan State Library. I'm not going to spend time on this. I can't because we don't have time. But we also have images of people actually having a gridded, tablet, and then 1 square of this equals so many, squares of actual Earth. So these become very important for us when we begin to understand how is it that, if you want geometrical thinking, planning thinking, gets realized in actuality. Okay. Now, let's finish with Isfahan. Isfahan is a very interesting place because it's actually one and the other and the third. It has an old city. And the city more or less looked like this, you can see. And this is actually a survey that I did with a group of people from the Royal Ontario Museum. And we found, there's the city and here are its walls. But that's it. These are the walls that were built up in the 10th century, and then everything else from then on had no walls. So from that point of view, it actually breaks the mold. So all cities are walled. Well, no, you've got Isfahan. So all of this city, and we see it now this way, spreads into the region. This has to do with the early modern period. So this is already a time when you have cannons. You really don't have walls to protect you. You have other things. You go fight battles somewhere else. And then it spreads into its region by utilizing a whole other idea of planning, and this is gardens. It has gardens that go across the river all the way into the territory. The reason it can do this is that it is now connected in the 17th century with global trade. It becomes the location in which you have all kinds of travelers coming, literally from England to Muscovy to Peru. Here is a plan, and I'm going to actually, so here's the old city. You can see all of its parts with the old mosque up there. This is the new Maidan I'll talk about in a minute. Palace, and then all of this is simply Garden City, and then on the other side of the river is the very important Armenian suburb of New Julfa. We did a mapping of every crossing of this city, and we know very well that we have, for instance, where are the baths located? Where are the mosques located? Where is the synagogue located? At what different times this is? I don't have time to really get into it, but we can do this on the basis of simply the urban matrix. Here is a survey of a residential block. And now we come to this problem of inheritance. Who inherits what? So for example, let me draw attention to, here are the through streets, right, around it. This is dead end. So here's a dead end street, and it hits this one courtyard house. But scrambling around in the archives, talking to people, we figured out that, in fact, originally, this, and this were all one house that had 3 courtyards. But through this, the dynamic of inheritance laws, they were divided up until the original plot was hardly recognizable. So the old center now comes, and you see it there, number 1, and now the new center. And the new center has really 2 parts. One is the great new Maidan, the great new square, and then this garden avenue that connects to a series of gardens across the river. And it connects also, and the reason this is important, is that the river is treated exactly as if it were a channel in a garden. And so this is why the bridge that goes across it was completely decorated, and it looks like a garden pavilion rather than a bridge. That was the whole idea. Here is an old aerial photograph where you see the Garden Avenue is there, and the actual Maidan is in a different location. Now the plaza itself. The entrance palace, right here, to the organizational and administrative zones, the huge, huge square, connecting on one side to the bazaar, and on the other to the new mosque. And notice its orientation. It's not oriented to Mecca. It's oriented to the new year. To the new year, to the Nowruz. And this is what Jean Chardin, who there are more than 50 European travelers' accounts about this new place. This is what he says. The Maidani Shah can pass for one of the most beautiful squares in the whole universe. Well, the man did say a lot. And then I'm not going to read it all. You can read it separately. But the main thing is that it was planted with trees. It was, and it was a space that was both available, open, and available for a variety of occasions. And it was what are squares? Why do we even have them? You know, we have some in Philadelphia, and the only one that's really left is Rittenhouse. You know? The others have been kind of eaten away. So here is the Gate Palace. From atop of it, and also the areas around it, you can actually see what's happening in this whole huge open place. Here are the views looking toward the new mosque that was built by the new founder, right, Shah Abbas. And now is a view this way. So every person who was up here could actually, the shops were at the bottom, on top were coffee houses. It was a surprise to me because when I spent time in Iran, they were drinking Nescafe, yuck. But apparently, at this time, part of the global trade was, in fact, indeed to have the best mocha, right, from Yemen. And these were all coffee houses. Okay. So here is another view, so you have an idea of, and then at the bottom you have all of these different shops selling things from around the world. This is actually another view. So now at the other end, as I said, is the end of the old bazaar, which is now being redone for this new early modern venture. Because basically this is what Shah Abbas and the economic advisors around him wanted to do, is to make sure that they would outbid the Ottomans. No, don't go to Istanbul, come here. And of course, the port for it was Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf. So that's here are the various caravanserais, mint, all of this is available here. And then further, upon looking at the entrance to the bazaar, now let me just go back, and so the entrance to the bazaar, as you see, is right there in the middle, and it has a facade, and on this facade, as I was working there, finally they cleaned it, and lo and behold, so not only do you have, right, the horoscope for Nowruz right there, but you have a whole series of paintings right there on the square. And what are they? Here they are, cleaned off. Painting of people hunting, a variety of hunts, etc., of this sort. Okay. And then the bazaar itself has covered streets from which you can enter a variety of establishments, including caravanserais, shops, and what have you. So when Cornelius de Bruyn comes to visit, this is a traveler who starts out in the Netherlands, We have his writings, and they're available in French, in Dutch, and in German. Anyway, and he goes from Muscovy to Persia until finally he gets to the Indian Ocean. And here is what the Maidan looked to him when he saw it. Think of it. The permanent areas here, and then the other areas are this is the Thursday bazaar. This is what, you set up for the market day, whatever the market day is. Now, taking this and then going into the early modern city, and I'm going to spend not very long, just a little view into just this little area here that was developed at the time that the new thing was setting up. It's actually, Isfahan has channels coming off the river for suburban gardens. And at some point, as it spread, here's one channel, and it has a particular name in the local Isfahani dialect. And then over here is what is called a personal foundation complex. A mosque, a bath, and a whole series of shops on a covered street. But it's not huge. It's quite small. And we know it because we have a document, the document of foundation. So I give so much and so much and so much for this to be built, and then this is what should be there and there and there. And so I managed to actually, with a team, to actually make a plan of it, and I want to draw your attention to the bath. So all of this is the bath. So you enter here. This is your dressing room. Then you have the hot rooms, etc., and finally there's the swimming pool. That was a surprise, believe me. I didn't know that there was a swimming pool. And at the end of the swimming pool, and let me show you exactly where it is, right here on this wall, not quite well visible, we found this. And it is a depiction of exactly that great parade avenue where you have people here. And of course, it's made in cuerda seca, in the cuerda seca technique. I'll explain if anybody wants to know what it is. And it's an image of this avenue. And it's transferred onto, tiles. These are tiles. Right? Yeah? And it is this. Okay, now let me show you why I think so. Because here it is. So, we know that Ali Kuli Aga gave money for his complex being built out here in an area that is quite far away from the main drag. We have the foundation document. And then Cornelius Lebrun, who visited Isfahan in about 1710, makes this image, but somewhere that print of the image was circulating around so that the potteries in Isfahan made an image for the bath in Isfahan of this original view. Right? And this is why we know that we have to think globally. Okay? So the Bidabad, this place is over here. The Grand Avenue is there. All of the complexes that I've been talking about are there. So it's a small personal complex. It's as much money as this person had available. But it connects with exactly the idea of that in the early modern period, the world is a connected place. Prints as images travel. We have them everywhere. And here is the connection that we can find in a small bath on a cuerda seca set of tiles in Isfahan. Okay, I'm done. And I would be happy to entertain any questions if there are such. Yes, please.
How do zoning regulations come into play?
Zoning. Okay, so for example, this goes through the market inspector. I know for example, all kilns have to be outside built-up areas. That's a key. So, for example, when we were working on Rayy, we know that there's no point looking for kilns or kiln wasters or anything else of the sort in the town. We know where it is. It's actually on top of the prehistoric site, not very far away. So the kilns in particular were very carefully separated out. Who uses what water? If you have water that comes in through an underground channel, who can use it first, who can use it second, who can use it third? How much of it? So there are actually timing devices that you can irrigate your field for this and this amount of time. The timing device is actually a very interesting one. There are really two bowls, one floating in the other, and then when it floats up to a certain point, that's enough of the water that you can use. So that is regulated as well. Who keeps the underground channels, the qanats, clean is also under the muhtasib, under the market inspector, or the zoning inspector, in fact. And all of it, in the end, has to do with how whoever is in authority actually then administrates down the line into these specialized areas. There were actually specialized people who did nothing but clean and dig qanats, these underground water channels. I'm not sure I answered all of it, but yes, sir.
Did the wealthy and the poor people live in the same area? Or was it not?
Interesting question. So let's begin with the idea of inheritance. There's a house. The house has around 3 courtyards. In the next generation, it's divided up. Some members of the family buy out people, right? Some don't, and so they make their own they divide it up. So at some point or another, what we found was the big old house was somewhere here, but over time, and you could see that it was probably over 3 generations, the big mansion, and now is no longer a big mansion. It's a bunch of small houses. That now the reverse is also true. So the great gardens that we see in Isfahan, these are all inhabited by landowners that have, have pavilions. I mean, these are all, if you want, pavilions, and they also have some other place outside, completely in the rural zone. So yes, I mean there is it's not zoned outright, but when you actually see what happens over time, even in a place that I excavated, right? So how is it that all of this wonderfully laid out series of houses, when we were looking at them in the 12th century, I mean they're just it's a warren. So there is actually a kind of a degradation of the original plan, for sure. Yes. Yeah, you, please. Yes.
They are projecting that by the 2050, 75% of the Earth's population will be living in cities.
Yes.
How do you think they will manage? It's a heck of a lot of people in cities.
Yes, and look at New York.
Yeah.
You have,
And also, do you think it's a natural inclination of a human to be in a city with other people, or?
Actually not. I think that there is the opposite inclination as well, to be outside in ruralia. Otherwise, you don't have this concept of the beautiful countryside. William Penn came and said he was going to make a beautiful countryside here. So I think that there's always a tension between one and the other. Our problem is that we can build skyscrapers, huge ones, right? And pile people up like this. That's basically a new thing. To have a 3-story a house, I mean, a three-story building in Isfahan, such as the Gate Pavilion, is already a major thing. You simply, structurally, we have very different materials, and so we think of it in a different way. Yes?
Okay, just a brief comment on this question. I mean, the city is obviously the result of very strong economic drivers.
Yes.
That bring people together, and more and more people is just economically
Right.
much favorable. My question, however, is this. So the concentration of people in the cities also created public health problems, obviously, big ones.
Yes.
And I wonder, so the Arabs were leaders in medicine and history. So did they, when did they catch on that this was a problem?
Yeah.
When were hospitals created, etc.? Could you address
Okay.
that?
There are several problems, but anyway, let's begin with one thing. Just on basic sanitary levels, we have adduction of clean water, and the taking away of waste is the regular lookout for exactly the people who are in charge of the city. So, in fact, the market inspector and his crew. So that's the first thing. The second, in terms of the way in which hygiene was looked at, it's a very, very interesting, complex issue. First of all, not sure whether you realize that between 560 and 750 CE, right, there was the Justinianic plague, right? Yeah, there was the Justinianic period plague happened. And so, in fact, you have a great lowering of population exactly during this time. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, for sure, going as far west as Tunisia. I know this because of the work that I did on the island of Jerba. And we do not know yet how far east it went. But that was a whole other part. We're only thinking about it now. Secondly, we have also the huge climate variation. So it snowed in Baghdad in the 10th century. This means that all of the typical climate productions, such as, even whether or not you're going to get one kind of harvest or another, were essentially shaken through the 10th century. We have not yet really mapped it back out onto the cities. That's yet another whole thing. I mean, that's literally over the last 10 years we've been talking about this. So that's the second in these large problems that can be looked at now through this. And then comes another whole aspect of it. Because the Islamic world connected what was the old Persian Empire with what was the old Roman Empire, you actually had a huge change in agronomic practice. What do I mean by that? You had the acculturation, for example, of South Asian cultivars, already begun in the 6th through 8th century under the Sasanians in the Persian Empire, but then continued. What are these cultivars? Why is this important? Well, it's really important because, first of all, in the old Mesopotamia, summer was the fallow season. Nothing grew. It was too hot. But now you import a South Asian grain, and you can crop year-round. Okay? So over the shorter term, Baghdad, that's huge. So they're using all of it all the time. Over time, what happens is if you do not flush your land carefully and allow it to rest, it salinates. So you look at Baghdad in the 13th century, and it's shrunk. So that's another issue. Cotton was imported from South Asia. Rice was imported from China. All of these are new cultivars that did not exist prior to the 8th to 10th century. in the entire Middle East. Each of them has a capacity to support either industry or actual food in a very different way than had been true previously. These are yet other issues that we are only now beginning to, well, okay, why did Rayy explode like this? Well, because it was the best watered plain on the Iranian Plateau. What were they growing there? Well, all of this. However, I can't go and do the paleobotanical stuff because it's now become all Tehran. It's all 21 million people. Okay? Yes?
So I'm wondering about the description of cities as inherited, fiat, and
Yeah.
organic.
Right.
And whether that's peculiarly Islamic or whether that's a sort of a generic model that we can apply in general. I'm sort of,
Yeah.
in my mind, trying to apply it to America or the United States.
Sure.
And I can come up with fiat cities and I can come up with organic cities, but I really can't come up with an example of an inherited city.
Well, Philadelphia is an inherited city. Actually, the planned city is tiny. The rest is all, inherited.
Philadelphia is a fiat city.
Well, no, I know, but it's tiny. The Fiat part is tiny, right? It was just between the two rivers, and that was it.
Yeah.
But all of this other addition is already, yes.
Would you call that organic?
Yes, because it took off, and it was doing well, and so people were adding until finally you got something else. And further, it's also a garden city, right? Because, of course, you have the park movement, and otherwise you wouldn't have the parks along the Schuylkill River and such. So these are not necessarily only issues that deal with the Islamic world. It's actually, when you're talking about urbanism, you can actually look at it. I mean, people live in cities and try to make the best of where they are. And why do they live in cities? Well, we had the opposite. Why do we have in the commuter railroads? That was actually moving out, right? Don't want to live in the city. The city smells, it's awful. We're going to live, in the wonderful countryside. So there's always the opposite to it, somewhere. But things happen in the city and it's more fun. Maybe that's it, I don't know. Yes, over there in the back. Set up. Oh, you want to take my course? I can't, it's a process, but we know that by the time Baghdad is set up, at the very least, the idea that you have a market inspector and all of this is already functioning because we had slightly earlier cities that are already functioning in this way. Plus the fact you still have the inherited cities that, after all, Damascus was there before, and they were living in the city perfectly, as well as they could. So you see, here's the other thing. What happens during conquest? Okay, the top disappears, but the functionaries are still there. Yeah. And so somebody said, no, this is not how we do it. The water on the Ghouta comes from here and here and here, and this is what you need to do. Okay. So the question of how does a certain urban order, right, respond to new conditions over time is, a complex one, for sure. So I say you should take my course. Yes?
Could women inherit property and
Yes.
be director of female architects?
There is women can inherit according to a formula depending on which legal school you belong to. So for example, if you're a Shi'i, women can inherit exactly the same amount. If you're a Sunni, there are 4 legal schools and each one has a different opinion. Ascending, parallel, and descending family also inherits according to a formula. The way around it is to set up a foundation where you name Betty and Mary and, cousin Rachel as the main administrators of the foundation. And so they then have the money to inherit, I mean, and to essentially deal with the, with all the goods. But, you know, we have foundations, we have essentially a very interesting system that tries to avoid death taxes. Yes. So, what we see all told in the larger, on larger scale is that when you actually look at the urban fabric, you can see the impact, right, of this division physically, house by house, literally. And it surprised me when I first saw it. Whoa, okay. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yes. They are inherited. They have, as I said, the Cordoba and Medina Zahra are exactly the same, have the same relationship as Baghdad and Samarra, and as Fustat and Cairo. It's exactly the same relationship. And that you have a multi-confessional series of city dwellers, no matter where you go. Well, if there are no other, oh, yes. Oh, no. Anyway, yes, one more question.
When you divided the property,
Yes.
how did they get access if they had
Well, no, actually, so let's say there is one.
the family dynamics, I guess?
Sure. And Aunt so-and-so has the first house off the public street, and she then controls anybody else that is next and next and next.